For those newcomers here, just so you know, we can't swear at this event because we have people in the valley and in the peninsula that on occasion tune in, so we try to keep it super clean. It's difficult, especially with Jean here for crying out loud. Anyway, Shannon's here with us today. You all know Shannon, you all know Jean. Shannon works with Mary Stevens at Crown Point. And that's a beautiful house. Wow. It was fun to see. The thing I learned from Shannon and Mary today, because I had the privilege of going on tour today. Yay! I got to went in Amanda's place. You see, my team fights to see who gets to go on tour. Yeah, we fight, and I won. Don't believe any of that. Welcome, sir. Welcome. Glad you're here. Look here. Carl draws an audience. Anyway, what I learned from Shannon is talk to us about carpeted flooring and new construction, Shannon, a little bit. I think it's good to know. Well,
on the spot.
The point is, all the latest new homes have had solid surface flooring, which is stunning, beautiful, especially with area carpeting on top. But this particular home, new home that Shannon and Mary have on the market has beautiful, what I call iron carpeting, because it doesn't show footprints. It's gone through the entire parade of homes without any discoloration on it. Hello, sir.
Yeah, even in any heavy walkways, it's not going to show any kind of wear, like on stairwells or in hallways or high traffic areas where it gets a little worn. It's not going to show that.
So the point I'm making is, in Alaska, carpeting is still pleasant because we like soft floors and warm toes and comfort on our feet, but they still do solid surface in higher traffic areas. But this home has some carpeting, and I thought it was just very cool that we're seeing carpeting come back in our homes, especially in Alaska. All right, so around the room, say, I confess, I'm a realtor. My name is Catherine Fernandez, and the most exciting thing in real estate that's happened to me in the last 2 days is I got a commission check. Think about that. Billy, you next. I confess.
I confess. I'm a realtor. I'm Billy Worthy.
I couldn't have been good stuff.
The most exciting thing that's happened to me in the last 2 days is I've started a fight for earnest money.
For the seller.
For the seller.
For the seller.
I'm Brian Williams, and I confess I'm a realtor. And the most exciting thing that's happened in the last few days is I have a listing prospect.
I'm Carl Bright. I confess I'm a realtor. The most exciting thing that's happened to me the last couple of days is dragging 2 transactions to closing, kicking and screaming all the way. But I won't quit.
Welcome back.
Thanks.
I confess.
My name is Phil Barnes. I confess I'm a realtor.
No, you're not. You're in trouble.
Realtor.
Thank you.
Bill, you put
I
up
know
your
the
face.
drill.
Did you know?
Last exciting thing that's happened in the last couple of years. I rented a house and listed a piece of land.
Wow. What's the land?
It's Fairview, 10,000 square feet, R4, flat lot, nothing built on it. Utility stuff.
Where did that business come from?
Just somebody I've known for a long time. And she talked to me like 2 years ago about listing it, and like a phone call out of the blue.
I love those outdoor calls. Because you're a realtor. If you were a realtor, she never would have called you. They don't exist.
I know, right?
You wouldn't
My
have
name
come up
is
when
Gene
you Googled
Fitzgerald.
yet.
I'm a realtor. And the most exciting thing that's happened to me the last 2 days is I was negotiating my $1 million listing and 5 airplane rides. So that's what.
Would you like to go into a little detail?
Yeah. My guy that's selling this property used to own a Beaver aircraft and was no longer able to fly. So the gentleman that's buying the property owns 5 of them. So in the process of negotiating the sale, we negotiated some airplanes. Yeah, it was fun. It kind of took the edge off everything.
And what's the sales price?
$1.1 million. Yeah. Yeah.
Maria Jean, that's
So
exciting.
is it pendant?
We're still working on it.
Okay.
Almost, we're
You're the
almost.
pendant side.
One more airplane ride.
Yeah.
My name is Terry Ellis. I confess I'm a realtor, and the most exciting thing that's happened to me in the last few days is I've got a firm buyer and 2 prospective buyers depending on my.
Excellent.
All right.
Good story.
What's in my card?
My name is Suzanne. I confess I'm a realtor, and the most exciting thing to happen to me in the last 2 days is that a buyer client and I have gone through experience of losing a deal because we weren't fast enough. And that was exciting and disappointing because we learned a lesson.
There's a lot to be learned from that, yeah. I'm working with a buyer client that has lost 4 houses.
Just not moving fast enough? Or?
I would say 2 didn't, well, when I first met with them, they were looking for a deal. I mean, if it wasn't a deal, they didn't want to buy it. So they started making offers that were deal type offers. And wasn't skilled enough to convince them that that was a mistake. Plus, you kind of have to let buyers figure this out on their own, because if you're pushing them to make these really good offers, they think you're doing it just for the extra $12 commission, because they don't do the math. But, so they kind of have to learn on their own. So now these buyers are making every house they want to put an offer on there, they're ready to make an above list offer, and they want an escalation clause in every one. I mean, if there's no reason for one. Okay, we're gonna do it.
Ah.
But they lost 4. And they're not able to make it, they just don't make it. That's okay. So just hang in there.
Can I interrupt?
Yes,
That's
sir.
good that you actually go.
Can you explain an escalation clause?
Absolutely. And then it's actually, I think in our forms program, they've even got some language in the forms program for that. But an escalation clause would be a buyer that says in his offer, here's my offers for, let's say, $300,000, but I will pay an additional $1,500 or $1,000 or $10 above the next highest net offer that the seller has. And then what you have to remember to do is cap that, because they could be spending 30 grand above list. You always put a cap on it, with a cap of 310,000. And then the other thing that, and especially with these buyers, because they wanted this escalation clause, and in my opinion, an escalation clause should not be used whimsically, because if the seller knows that the buyer could pay more and would pay more, then why wouldn't the seller say, hey, by the way, I really like the offer, but now that I know that you've got a lot of money, I want you to pay more. So I think an escalation clause is dangerous as well. So what I did in this particular case is I said, in the event there are no competing offers, this offer stands pat. So it was us saying, don't play games, this is our offer, we'll only do the escalation if there's another offer. And I had never thought of that until this particular offer that I wrote yesterday.
Do you ask for a copy of the other offer?
And we always ask for a copy, yeah. So in other words, to answer your question, if the seller says, I do have another offer, I want your offer because it's $1,500 better, then that seller has to provide that better offer for the buyer's ability to prove to the buyer that there really was one. Else, no.
That's good.
Yeah. Good point, Jean. Okay, sure. Whose turn is it? Oh, it's your turn.
I could skip.
No.
My name is Lisa Weisman, and I confess I'm a realtor. And the most exciting thing that's happened to me in the last 2 days, well, I got to help Luke, the stager, stage a beautiful house on Hocus. That was fun.
Oh, that was interesting.
Yeah, I've never worked with him.
Who did you help?
Luke Sherman,
Oh, great.
yeah, the one that Bill uses, and Kathy Johnson. So he came on recommendation. So it was fun.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it was
So-
interesting.
Can I interrupt again?
No, no, go ahead. Please.
Are there companies that rent whole furniture packages for people to use to live?
That's a stage.
Not a staging, but
Oh, to live with it.
because I've done floor time and I've had people that I'm helping that
Is there a rent to own thing?
I mean, is that what RTO is?
Right, yeah, they'll do like a couch and a
Everything.
coffee table and bed and for a certain, yeah, it's just like leasing a car.
And there's errands too. AARONS. And those can be pretty expensive.
Okay. I'll stop interrupting.
No.
No, you wouldn't.
You're right.
I'm Shannon Ingram. I confess I'm a realtor. Past couple of days, I've pended a property for my little sister and her family, which is exciting, and it's close to our new house. And then I just scheduled a builder's meeting for some clients that I met with 2 months ago and have not heard anything back from them. They called me out of the blue today too.
That's exciting.
Hello, my name's Amanda. I confess that you're my realtor. I'm gonna go back on the most exciting thing that, yes, no, the most exciting thing that's happened to me is I got on my social media app, and I had a message from a guy I used to go to high school with. Hey, you're a real estate agent, right? And I said, yes. And anyway, long story short, that is the duplex listing, and the lead came from Snapchat, of all places.
Oh, all right.
One of the homes on tour, Lou had it on, not Lou, his friend. Tyler had it on tour, and I was there with Tyler and a couple of cats. It looked like me. I feel like my hair's straight all over me. Anyway, I like cats. I asked Tyler, I would like to know where business comes from, and Tyler said it's from his Facebook page. Just a friend of his saw him on Facebook and remembered he had been a realtor, but didn't know he was still a realtor. So Tyler said that's bad for me that he didn't even know for sure. So he's not marketing or not targeting himself on them. Okay, let's talk about points real quick, Carl. Who's winning? Who's losing?
Winners, winners, winners. Team 2 is doing quite well. It's, myself, Billy, and Amanda, 161 points. Team 3 wants to be in the game. Really just a two-person team with 100 points, so well done them. That's Chelsea and Kathy. Team 1, Kelly, Brian, Suzanne have 89 points, with Suzanne bringing in 74 of those points. So,
Suzanne.
Captain Suzanne.
Well, Kelly's gone, so.
Kelly's gone.
Right. And this goes through the beginning of July, and so there's still plenty to play for.
All right, so our presentation today this was Carl's idea, because Carl reads the contract. That's why we're here today. And we patterned this presentation about after a song that was sung by, who do you remember who it was, Carl?
No offhand.
The name of the song was 60 Ways to Leave Your Lover. So we came up with 11 ways to leave your contract. And contrary to what Jean said earlier before you all showed up, our purpose here is not to help you get out of every contract that you help your buyer and seller get into. It's to know the contract and know the pitfalls and what a seller or a buyer or the other realtor who read the contract can pull over on you if you don't know the real reasons to terminate the transaction. So Carl, you are on.
Awesome. And yeah, so we've got them marked, and as a fun little game, after we read each of these clauses, you've got to place a circle there. Whose responsibility is this? Is it the listing side and the selling side to make sure that this doesn't fall through in that particular way? Just a fun little way to make sure we're paying attention. And then if you guys have stories or anecdotes about how this one had or had not bitten you in the past, or you were able to use this to help your client, jump on in. But we'll just start here on the first page, down there on 3A. So with an all-cash offer, and these don't apply to all transactions. But if you've got an all-cash offer, you're going to want to know this clause would apply to you and could bite you if performance doesn't happen. So the buyer needs to provide proof of funds by that date. We're all used to filling in that date. Critically, the seller has 3 days after receipt of that to notify the buyer if it's not acceptable. And then highlight beneath that is the meat of the matter. If the buyer fails to provide such documentation, or if the seller finds verification of funds unacceptable, seller may terminate this purchase agreement. And so you want to not be lazy about getting them that proof of funds, and you want to not be lazy about getting that proof of funds to your seller to have a look at it and say, is this sufficient to you or not? Any immediate thoughts or ideas or on that?
One of my thoughts, Carl, would be sure on your timeline for the proof of funds that you don't make it so tight that you're instantly out of contract. You really need to talk to your buyer and find out how available those funds are. And proof of funds typically will come in the form of providing a bank statement, but many bank statements reveal more about the buyer's financial situation than the seller needs to know or wants to know. So in some cases, you can get a bank official to write a letter. And then the other thing about sufficient funds to close is not just the sales price, it's the closing cost. So if the sales price is $300,000 cash, there's still, even in a cash transaction, some buyer cost to pay. So you might need to figure that out and validate that there's indeed $305,000 available funds to close. The funds to close isn't just for the sales price.
So if your seller gets cold feet shortly after getting a contract and they don't provide proof of funds, your seller has a way to say, either you didn't give me the proof of funds or I'm not satisfied with this in writing, and the seller has the option to terminate the contract there. So in that kind of way, whose responsibility do you think it is to really pay attention to this clause in the contract, the listing side or the selling side?
I would say both.
I would say both. We're all good with that. Anyone want to fight Kathy on that?
I did. We're not supposed to discriminate as realtors, and we don't. Would there be a reason, or are they allowed? Is there, the seller maybe accepted the contract one day, and then for whatever reason decided he didn't like the buyer based on whether it be like race, religion, ethnicity, that kind of stuff? Can they say, oh, no, later and be like, I'm not satisfied with their proof of funds, even if it was in fact perfectly?
Well, there's hard timelines in this, right? So it says the seller should have 3 business days after receipt of documentation to notify buyer. And so to get to the meat of your matter, they can't terminate a contract for exactly those reasons. And if your client is like, I don't want to sell to this guy because of the race, you fire that client and say, I'm not going to help you commit a crime here. However, if your client is a racist and is not satisfied with the proof of funds, talk with your broker.
Well, bottom line is a seller does not have to sell his property.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what it comes to, regardless of the reason for which he chooses to not sell his property. He doesn't have to sell his property.
If your seller sends you an email saying, I'm not going to sell it to any, for instance, black people, then send that email to your broker and fire your client. Because that's just court
I
fodder.
agree with you. Once in my career, we've had to pull our specific performance card. I was representing a buyer. Buyer did everything right. Seller just kind of at the last minute went into a tailspin and said, I just don't want to sell. And my buyer wasn't going to let her off the hook. And so we pulled a specific performance card and she sold her house.
Yeah. Well, you have, at a certain point, you can take it to court and be forced to sell your house, yeah.
And now,
okay, then I agree with that further explanation.
And now, Carl is saying fire the client, racist or whatever have you. Do you agree with that? I don't know. I feel like you would try to negotiate with him to see logic. I don't know.
Kathy, you a racist?
You have to be able to.
No,
I mean,
Okay, let's get off the air.
Yeah, no, I hear Gabe's head exploding,
I do too.
and we're a little off topic.
I was going to say he didn't want to sell the pond. So, but anyway.
Well, I don't try to, if I have a seller client that is not going to play by federal law and rules, I don't try to teach them. I don't try to change their mind. I just say, I don't think we can work together, but I know with KW Realty that we love to work together.
Yeah, it's a massive liability. That's just, it's not going to be worth your license or the commission check.
And we would in fact be liable for that, even though it's not
We would
us discriminating.
If we work with that client, I submit we would have culpability.
Even if he
and
never
responsibility.
outright said, I'm not going to sell to a blonde person.
Well, I understand that. As a blonde. I understand.
Jumping mercifully ahead to page 2.
Well, wait.
Oh, okay, yeah. Let's talk page 1.
So everybody here seemed to say that the buyers, both the buyers and the sellers' responsibility for the proper documentation of the funds, isn't it? If the seller's not happy, isn't that because the buyer didn't?
Well,
Do
so-
the selling realtors' jobs to make sure that that is satisfied.
Yeah, we're talking about like the listing or the selling side. And in this clause, there's performance necessities for both. The buyers have a performance hard deadline to provide those funds. The seller has a hard deadline to say this is or is not acceptable. And so in that, for the purposes of this clause, both have a stake in the game. Is my thought there.
Any other questions?
Page 2 we skip because it's the boring page. Plenty can still go wrong on this page. Please pay attention to it. But for our purpose today, we're going to move on with our lives.
There's nothing exciting on there?
Oh, there's so much exciting on there, but it's only like a 45-minute presentation.
Just circle the cost section.
Yeah, just look at the splits. We could do a whole class on splits. We shouldn't. So 7E is another way a transaction can terminate, which is what we're focused on here. If within X amount of business days, 3 have not filled in. So we need to go back for a bit more context. This refers to the preliminary title commitment. We get our preliminary title commitments. Those get forwarded on to our clients, and we advise our clients to look through them and make sure everything seems satisfactory. Now, within getting it, the buyer shall have 3 days, if not filled in, to notify the seller in writing any matters in the report which are unacceptable to the buyer. Buyer's failure to timely object in writing shall constitute acceptance of the report. So that's an important performance deadline. However, it's not necessarily what will cause the transaction to terminate. They will just lose their opportunity there to object to what's in the prelim. Now, if they do that, the buyers have now sent their objection to the seller. If within 3 days, if not filled in, following receipt of the objection, seller fails to remove or correct the matters or does not give written assurance reasonably satisfactory to buyer, they will remove or corrected, the transaction shall automatically terminate. And so in that instance there, your buyer or a buyer has said to the seller, I'm really concerned about this lien on the property. Is that going to be an issue? The seller doesn't respond within 3 days. Your PSA is now terminated without anyone needing to do anything else about it. It's an automatic termination there. So on that one, I was just saying whose responsibility do we feel that is, listing or selling? I'm inclined to for the purpose of this weighing, I lean more towards the listing side because it's their job to respond to the buyer's objections if there are.
But on the other hand, if you sold a property and your buyer has received a preliminary title commitment, we have an obligation to have also reviewed the preliminary title commitment, primarily looking for liens that nobody seemed to be aware of, child support liens, IRS liens. And so I had a situation recently where there was some problems with setbacks that showed up in the title commitment. And I hadn't read the title commitment because I'd gotten lazy and I wasn't reading them. What I was doing with the title commitment is I zoomed to the back page and looked for liens. Many times the good title person also will call you and say, by the way, I've noticed there's these liens, and so we can appreciate it, but you can't rely on that. So I'm always looking for liens, and what I didn't look for with this particular buyer client was there was some setback issues that had not been cured. And that, in fact, ultimately that's what killed our deal. The buyer found it, and I felt badly because he lost the deal over that issue that the seller couldn't resolve in a timely manner, and I felt like I should have also caught it. So even though title reports are pretty boring, don't read them at night and never get through them, you'll fall asleep. I still feel it's on the buying licensee side, it's not, we have a responsibility to review those every page or call title. Say, I don't understand everything I'm reading, Mr. and Mrs. Title person. Is there something here that I should be concerned about? And I wish I'd done it with this particular buyer.
You can ask the title person to read it for you, go through it line by line.
Yeah, especially the title reps, that's their job. They want your business. And they know more about their title commitments than I'll ever know.
That's actually a better way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you interpret a title one way and it's actually the other way, then that puts you in a bad position. So it's better to, if you have a question on it, to go to a title person and ask
For
them,
translation.
you know, can you explain this to me? Is it of concern? Does it concern the title company? Should it concern my buyer? You know, because they're supposed to, you know, give you a clear title or offer the buyer a clear title at closing. But if you don't deal with it up front, then, and you wait down the road, it could cost your buyer's earnest money. Because once you have that information, everything's time sensitive. So if you wait 2 weeks and you say, oh, I decided, you know, to bring this up, wow. Yeah.
So I submit that is both on the listing and the selling side to be responsible.
So ordered. And Kathy brings up a good point. It's not just the liens in the title agreement we're looking for. It's also easements on the as-built. And as Gabe has pointed out in risk management, it is also notes on the plat that have all been that are all part of this title report. All should be okay with your buyer. And if not, the buyer definitely needs to get that word over to the seller ASAP.
I'm gonna interrupt.
Yeah.
I was coming into the office today. This is kind of totally unrelated, but there was a couple walking out and they had a binder in their hand from the title company. And they opened the doors, they walked outside, they both high-fived each other, gave themselves a big hug and walked off holding hands and they stuck the file. I hope I can make somebody feel that.
Oh, you will.
Yeah.
You will.
It was great.
Every month you're going to do that. It's a good feeling. Nice point, Brian.
On to page 4. I presume there's as many as 4 issues here. So isn't that exciting? Jumping down to 9K. This is where the buyer gives the seller copies of the reports, of any inspection reports, anything written, any documentation. Critically, what this says is this becomes a material amendment to the property disclosure statement. Upon the receipt by buyer of any new such property disclosure, that includes the inspection report, but more critically, that could be anything, in my opinion, and Gabe, run down here and punch me if I'm wrong, is anything benign as the other side sending you an email saying, hey, just so you know, we didn't put it in our disclosure, but they did replace this one window in the bedroom. That's an update to the disclosure. And any update to a disclosure, a buyer has 72 hours, or is otherwise allowed under Alaska state law, which I didn't look up, to terminate this purchase agreement. So that is, that's a heck of a get out of jail free card.
Can I tell a story that is still shocking to me about that particular sentence? So I sold a property to a nice young man who was buying on the Kenai Peninsula. And I don't zoom down there every day and sell houses, by the way. We had to go through I was able to talk my assistant into doing all the legwork. So she drove him down there over 2 weekends in a row, looked at houses. Finally decided on a home that he liked. And I wrote the offer and we were successful. Now this was a home for well and septic. I did drive down for the inspections. The septic failed. So the septic failed. And so in order to get a loan approval, of course, we had to have a new septic. The new septic, this buyer was going to get a brand new septic system, hello. But because the new septic took that nice lawn and tore the lawn up and made big mounds, buyer decided he just didn't want to buy the property because the lawn was torn up. So I took it back to Gabe. I said, Gabe, can he do this? He said, absolutely, because the property that he thought he was buying has been materially changed. And he was able to get out of the contract with the other realtor and broker kicking and screaming, and he got his earnest money back and he didn't buy the property. Which is a glaring example of this sentence. It doesn't make any sense why he would not want to buy. You can always plan a lawn, but he chose not to buy because of the lawn was torn up. Amazing. I'm sorry, keep going.
But all right. So that's just very interesting to keep in mind. Whenever you get a material update to the property disclosure, whether the buyer or seller feels it's important or not, a 3-day time period has started, as realtors, we should be aware of that time period. No need to make a fuss about it, but if they say, I'm super worried about that new window, we say, well, you've got an option if you really want to pursue it. Or calm down, it's just a window. On 9L, which is directly underneath that, so buyer's request for repairs, remedies, or termination shall be in writing. And that's as far as that goes. But to just further clarify that, there is a hard deadline to put a request for termination in there when it comes to the inspection period. So you don't need to go all the way through to submitting a repair amendment, countering that back and forth, can't get into agreement. Immediately after inspections, you can submit your termination, say, we're all good here. I've submitted it before the date.
Providing,
You have written documentation
Right.
to back that up.
and would you like to tell your lovely story about that very issue?
So, home inspections
We
were,
represent the seller.
we represent the seller on this one. Home inspections were on Friday. On Saturday, I got a text message that said home inspection didn't go well and buyers will be backing out. So when I called for clarification, I told the other licensee, he said, I wasn't there at the home inspection. It was just the buyers and the home inspector. Okay. I guess I'll just wait for he said there were some structural issues found, and that driveway, to be fair, it's a terrible, terrible driveway. That driveway, just with the snow gone, they couldn't finally see it, and it was just a little bit too much. I said, okay, so I'll just wait for the report to find out what the structural issues were. He said, no, there's no report. They stopped the home inspection, and the inspector didn't make a report. You know, he didn't even charge them. I said, well, can you tell me what the structural issues were? I wasn't even there. I don't know. Okay. Do you want to talk to your clients so they can tell you, so you can tell me? You better just call the home inspector. Very well.
Okay, can I interrupt now, because I want to put this on the table. So this other realtor prepares a termination agreement, asking, of course, if the seller agree to give the money back to the buyer. What does anybody who wants to address this, what should our seller do? What do you think the seller should do? Anybody?
Ask for inspection report.
There wasn't one, so what do we do? Good job. Yeah. Yeah. If you really look at this document without a written report, they can't just whimsically back out and expect their money back. But I'd never experienced that before, and I hadn't memorized the contract, and don't ever really want as long as Gabe's around. So we took it to Gabe, and even Gabe, as smart as Gabe is, had to actually read this very carefully. And we surmised that without a written inspection report, and by the way, the inspector's gone, he left town for a while. Without a written inspection report, within the deadline for providing one, the earnest money doesn't have to go back to the buyer. And that was fascinating information and a great story. In the meantime, we gotten a call from now the team leader saying, basically in the nicest possible, this isn't very nice that you're not giving his money back. Where did you? I said, well, that's what the contract says. And so we were in a conference call with him, and Billy had this in front of him, and the other guy didn't. But he tried to interpret, well, he has the right to back out. I said, no, he really doesn't. Without a higher authority giving him a legitimate reason, besides it needs to be something in writing. Yes, sir.
Wait though, the threshold for the inspection report, the deadline to have the inspection done, really represents the due diligence period. Actually, up to agreeing on repairs for this, the due diligence period on the contract. It's like if conditions change, if any new information comes forward, then that
information needs to be in writing.
That's what
it needs to be in writing.
That's what a home inspection is. It's an addendum.
To the
Rather,
property
it's an amendment to the
But I don't know that.
property disclosure.
I mean, maybe Gabe said it, but I don't know really. It's like if it's a higher authority. I mean, like if the snow melts and like the roof was covered with snow and the snow melts and there's a giant hole there, and now you can see it. It's new information.
Well,
So it's a reasonable judgment. So if okay, the driveway, the snow melts off the driveway and it's heaving everywhere, like, whoa, wait a second, this is more than you could tell while the snow is there. Then that's new information. Anybody reasonable could say, well,
Sure,
you know,
and I think,
yeah.
and
There's a hole in the roof, it better be on the property disclosure.
No, I'm being dramatic, but it's like,
Sure.
to me, it's almost like I don't really see why somebody you would have to have necessarily.
That's because that's what it says in the contract.
what could be debated is if the buyer sends an email saying, hey, the snow has melted, we see this driveway is in complete disrepair, we're no longer issued in the property, then whether or not that constitutes a written change or new information to the disclosure is up for smarter people to decide. But critically, what's in writing? You just can't call someone and say, we're sending a termination agreement, we're out, and expect you to get off scot-free that way. The conventional wisdom of they can back out for any reason in this time period still needs to be backed up. Unless I'm wrong.
Was there any offer or remedies or anything like that? It's just gonna walk away?
Nope, they decided they wanted to walk away.
Didn't ask for repair or anything?
Was it a single family? Condo? Single family?
Single family.
Was it in the homeowners association? There was a homeowners association?
Yeah, there is. What were you going to say?
I was, hold on, let me remember it. So then this buyer's being held to the fire. Could they go back to the home inspector and say, hey, can you put on paper somewhere?
Absolutely. That's his only remedy.
And then they would get there.
Yeah, and that's probably what the other realtor, you know, when we enlightened him on what the contract said, and he realized and said, well, if we could get something in writing from the home inspector, would that make a difference? And he said, yeah.
As long as it's within the time.
Within the right time. They've got tomorrow to provide it with the inspector out of town. But I'm sure and we're good with that. It's not like we wanted to keep the earnest money, and our seller really didn't even know that he could push back. But we have an obligation to protect our seller, and that's what it said. And so we shared with the seller that he could push back if he wanted to. It was his decision. We couldn't promise he would see the earnest money, because if the buyer complied, then the buyer likely should get his earnest money back. The most important, the trickle down on this, is this has been a seller that I've personally not been overly fond of, because he hasn't been honest with us all the time. But at the end of the day, we did our job anyway. We protected him and the bottom line. And that's what's important to me, is that we looked after the seller client for their job. Anyway, so Carl, keep going.
Right up.
So just one question above it there, on the line where it says, upon the receipt by buyer of any such new property disclosure, is the snow melting and you seeing something a disclosure, or is it disclosure a written document?
And
Carl,
see,
I
that's.
think it's possible in the seller's disclosure they did.
Well, in a hypothetical, if the snow melts and that presents new information about the property, the question is, was the seller aware of that driveway when the snow is on there or not? You know, if the seller didn't mention the driveway in the property disclosure, if the snow melts, wait, this driveway is crazy broken. There's a part in the disclosure to note that. Why wasn't it noted? And then it's like, oh, okay, yeah, it is broken. We're updating our disclosure. Cool, we're backing out of the contract. In that instance, it comes down to what did the seller know and when.
And does that, after inspections, let's say there's a massive windstorm and something happens to the house and the sellers are like, hey,
Buyer doesn't have to buy.
they don't have to buy, they could back out even a month down the line, even after.
Because something has changed to the
That is
property.
a massive dramatic directly.
Yeah. Like that windstorm.
And we will get to that clause, but quite right. So in M, there's a couple sections here. That one is saying we need to reach agreement by X date for repairs or remedies or what have you. So you have that hard deadline. If within 3 days you have not come to an agreement, you have 3 days. If not filled in, you can put in a different day there. The buyer can terminate the purchase and sale agreement right then and there. There's no need to haggle. There's no need to ruckus. We haven't reached agreement for repairs. I'm within my 3 days after that date. We're terminating this agreement. However, just below that, you will see if the buyer does not respond in the allotted time, seller may terminate this agreement in writing as outlined in paragraph 17, which is very fascinating boilerplate. So if the buyer says nothing 3 days after they haven't reached an agreement, the seller can say, well, then I'm terminating. I'm done playing with you, right? So just FYI, any questions there? Hard deadlines, yeah. Now this gets to Amanda's question on Q there at the top of page 5. In the event the improvements on the property are destroyed or materially damaged prior to recording, then, at the buyer's option, this purchase and sale agreement shall terminate upon buyer's written notice to seller. There's your windstorm, there's your lawn, tree on house, yeah. And so critical to know, because wind blows the fence over, the seller can't say, hey, you said you were going to buy it, not my problem. We say, oh, no, that's a material change, and the buyer absolutely has the right to back out. So you're going to want to know that particular part of the contract, whichever side of the transaction you're on, particularly if you live in a state with some crazy weather. Any thoughts, questions, ideas on
I just
that?
had that happen. We're supposed to sign today, record tomorrow. The buyer early occupied on a property, and the fence had blown over and it was propped up with like a 2x4 or something. And so we went back and said, they wanted some kind of credit to fix that. It can't be fixed now. The ground is frozen. And so we had to do an addendum and extend. We were able to sign tomorrow, but we were able to make it work, and they got a small credit for it.
Sure.
Yeah,
Because prior to closing, even though they were now living in the property,
yes,
something had changed, and they had the right to either get it corrected or back out.
Wow. Yes, indeed. Bring us to section 10C. This is about the completion of the purchase contingent upon the appraisal, and the property does not appraise for the purchase price or greater. Parties shall have, from receipt of appraisal to renegotiate the purchase price. In the event parties do not reach agreement on the purchase price within this time, the purchase agreement shall automatically terminate. So if you, and that's 3 business days, which again is important to remember. If you get an appraisal on Friday, you can't just walk away Monday, right? 3 business days. But it's a deadline you want to pay attention to, because there's not a hard date in that. It's when you receive the appraisal. You have 3 days to negotiate that if that's what you've agreed to. If you're outside of that 3 days, the agreement is automatically terminated. No notice needed, nothing need do.
And I have to believe, Carl, that receipt of the appraisal doesn't necessarily mean hard copy, it just could be an email. Would you agree?
I suppose, I suppose if there's a lender that sent an email, Gabe, stop me if I'm wrong. In my mind, I agree with you. If the lender sends an email saying, hey, the appraised prices came in this much, it's 10,000 low, good luck, your clock has started.
Right, and the other thing, in our purchase and sale agreements, we always write, Carl, you might know if it's actually in the boilerplate, but we add in under other terms and conditions that, how do we say this? We say, receipt of documentation by realtor, or something like this. Receipt of documentation by realtor is considered if the client has received the documentation. So when Carl gets a copy of the appraisal, the clock is ticking because Carl got it, even if the buyer didn't get it yet. So we put that in there, and I think it's somewhere in the contract as well, but we kind of make a big deal out of it. The only exception to that clause is receipt of the resale certificate. We specifically say if it's a resale certificate involved, that has to be received by the buyer before the clock starts ticking rather than us. Just FYI.
I would add that the email sent without a backup text is kind of like a mortal sin in real estate. I'm working on a deal now, and I keep finding magical emails. I get so many emails.
We all do.
And that I have to sort them out. And if you're not giving me a heads up that you've sent it and it's critical, it's kind of like, maybe
it's interesting that you said that. I'm going to say 3 years ago, if I didn't catch the email that I was sent, always felt like I wasn't doing my job. Anymore, if I didn't see the email, I don't feel even like apologize. I'm sorry I didn't see that email. You know, thanks for telling me you sent it, or maybe in the future, just call me,
Call or
text me.
text or
We
like
all get
notification.
millions of emails, and I don't think, I don't feel guilty anymore if I dismiss it, because I feel like I check my email consistently. We all should.
Yeah.
But we get a lot of emails. So that phone call or that text is critical.
Can't wait till we go. It was just like Slack.
What's that?
Slack. Anybody know what Slack is? There's like groups. Basically, it's like a communication platform. It's kind of like email, kind of like group collaboration. A lot of like tech companies use it, but it's like, you know, once you get in the deal, everybody gets invited, and then you get notifications through Slack that something's been sent. Everything kind of lives inside. I think it can actually do the same thing with SkySlope.
I think so.
It has, yeah,
Yeah.
roughly like less user friendly, I would.
SkySlope's not user friendly, but anyway.
Um,
Yeah, we almost need a system like that, though, just so you know you have a dedicated channel with somebody, because you're sending time-sensitive stuff, you know? An offer that's like it's gonna expire, and
Yeah.
I found an offer, it was expiring 6 hours, are you kidding? Like,
When you send an offer, you should always follow it up with a phone call.
always.
Absolutely.
That's your bad.
You never know the personality of the person you're working with, so anyways.
Or how diligent they are, if they, you know, they're asleep or
Yeah.
on vacation.
Almost learned this the hard way.
Did you have a thought?
Well, it just seems like it's come up a few times before that people have been allowed to move into a property before
It's recorded.
before it's recorded. And is it then typical to have some wording change in the
There,
contract
there
because
is
they're in
a-
the home?
there is a separate,
Separate form.
yeah, there's a separate two-page addendum that covers occupancy prior to recording, that handles those kind of things. However, that is still in place, unless for some reason the parties want to waive that right. But the occupancy prior to recording doesn't take the place of that.
So that there's not really an instance where the seller would say, well, you know, we'll let you in if you waive this.
They might.
The parties can agree to it if they want. If I was representing the buyer, I would say, no, we'll take the occupancy prior to recording, but that doesn't mean we're accepting the property as is as of this moment. Its recording is still that date. And if we don't get into agreement, say, well, then I guess we'll find a hotel and we'll wait till it records. But it's a rough thing to kind of saddle your buyer with.
A lot of builders do not like early occupancy. Is that, you agree? A lot of builders, well, in her case, they just simply won't do it. And there's a lot of risk for moving into a property and then something goes sideways. On the other hand, and I'm not advocating for early occupancy, I think it has everything to do with the parties, the other realtor, whether you feel you can trust their intentions. But there is something to be said as a woman, and I think women are more like this. If I move into a home I'm buying 30 days early for all kinds of right reasons, you're not going to blast me out of that house after I've moved in. So there's some protection of the transaction just because they have moved in, they've set up the play set, and the kids are all installed in their bedrooms, so there's a little protection there. But even if something minor goes sideways, that buyer's probably not going to back. But it's risky.
Speaking of which, I finally closed on my house.
After early occupancy.
After early occupancy and finding out that the septic system is 40 years old, when the average lifespan for a steel septic tank is 20 years old.
So Billy could
But I'm not going to back out.
And why did Billy move in before they had septic results? You want to share that strange story with us?
I mean, primarily, they didn't realize that they had to order a COSA.
The seller is a realtor on a team. She's a neophyte realtor on a team. So she allowed, and I'm sure that was the way they structured it, she allowed another team member to run the whole transaction for her as her realtor. So neither her realtor nor her as a realtor knew enough to order the COSA finally. And so the COSA was the last minute.
So we had to extend almost 3 weeks.
Now, having said that, I think we have responsibility as well, because we should have been aware of the fact the COSA wasn't ordered. And nor was the lender particularly aware of it either. It was really kind of strange. You just can't dot too many I's and cross too many T's.
No. But that was just to the point that I early occupied, and now there's security in the transaction coming to close because I'm early occupying. I don't want to try to renegotiate and get a new septic.
If you weren't living in the property, would that be any different?
It may have
Would you be
been,
more inclined to?
if it got in timely and before I occupied, possibly.
And sold your house?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, we might have worked out some kind of you pay half, I pay half kind of thing.
Are you getting?
No, not until absolutely necessary.
It passed, Gene, it passed. It was just a marginal.
Yeah. I had to sign a hold harmless.
Just in being in the house with the failed system.
Right.
True.
We would have had to
In fact,
enhance it.
yeah, in fact, one unfortunately, actually, that bonus failed. It was puking out CO2 in this house with these poor people that live in it that have no CO2 detectors anywhere. See what I say?
It's
what you breathe out.
carbon monoxide.
I'm sorry. I'm not. All right, my scientist over here.
I didn't say anything. I was
I
being
know.
quiet.
You were just
I
being
just
stupid.
agreed.
No, you were like processing it, going like, wait, is she really talking about CO2? Like, then we just said CO2 detector, like, talking about
CO detector. Yes. Sorry.
Sarah, you have a question?
I have a question. Especially for experience. Is it advisable, do you advise your client to put down in the market? Just
In my perfect world, for my seller clients with wells and septics, I do ask them to get a COSA done, as long as I think the home is saleable in a reasonable amount of time. If it's a real marginal, not gonna sell for a year, maybe not, because there's shelf life on some of those tests.
6 months or?
I want to say 6 months.
It's gotta be longer than that.
Well, these, a COSA is good for up to 2 years. Yeah, COSA is good, but it's the water test that has a shelf life of only 30 or 90 days or 6 months. Can you remember? 6 months, okay. But I lost a transaction when I did not ask some lovely, lovely sellers, older folks. Her home was so beautiful that she was always featured in all the garden tours. I mean, they loved this home. And I loved their home and loved working with them. And I asked them at the beginning if they would please get a well and septic inspection done. Oh, no, we have it checked every 6 months, every year, everything's fine, we're just not willing to do that, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine, whatever. So then we sell the house. Didn't sell right away, but we finally find a buyer. And when this well and septic inspection was done, it all failed. $40,000 redo on a well and septic system. The buyer backed out. Buyer said, I wonder really what else might be seriously wrong with your home if your septic system failed and you didn't have a COSA by the time they come in. Wow. So I really encourage them to do it, but they will, because that's pretty pricey. Well, it was a $40,000 fix.
No, for COSA.
For the COSA.
The COSA is about $2,500.
Something to tell your buyers.
Yeah. And when you sit down with your seller and work out an ad sheet, be sure and put that extra amount in
Can you, on the COSA, can you like do since the septic portion is 2 years, can you do that portion and then get the COSA with the water?
Yeah, you can.
In the water, is it, I should know this, is it a well test or is it a water quality?
It's a water quality and a production.
Can I put the well with that?
Carl, keep going.
On. 10E is the same kind of idea. The first 10C speaks to if it doesn't increase from the price. 10E speaks to if there are lender-required repairs. That also needs to be negotiated within a certain time frame. If not, it is another automatic termination. So if you get value, however, something needs to be fixed on the property, you have 3 days to negotiate. If you don't put in a different date, when that gets done.
You know, Carl, it's made me wonder, I tend to live with the 3 days that's in the boilerplate contract, that three business days for these various pop-out clauses. Do you think that we're better advised to extend that to like 5 days or 7 days on an automatic basis, or not necessarily?
I think it would depend, like your thoughts on the COSA, it would kind of depend on the property. If this is a property that's likely to have these kind of issues pop up, either for value or repairs, we might be more thoughtful. And of course, it's the buyer who's going to initiate this contract. And so if we, representing the seller, push back and say, we would like more time in case appraisal issues come up, that may well be a red flag to them. Sure. But if you're representing the buyer and you're looking at this property going, there's a possibility we're overpaying, or there's a possibility this foundation's going to need to be fixed, we might want to throw in some extra time there. You just put it in, and frankly, most realtors just kind of like, oh yeah, appraisal good, who's going to pay for it, and move on with the contract.
Exactly.
So don't be that guy. Just burning on through on 11, this speaks to the buyers unable to obtain a loan commitment through no fault of the buyer. So this speaks to if they did not commit mortgage fraud, however, the numbers just don't work, right? Buyer to provide written notice to seller immediately upon buyer learning of their inability to obtain loan commitment from lender. This purchase agreement shall automatically terminate unless seller and buyer agree to modifications that adjust the sales price, closing costs, what have you, to the purchase and sale agreement. So that's your loan originator saying they can't afford the house. We say, well, that's really bad news, but I've got to let the seller know that right now. If you hold off on that, you wait a couple days and say, well, I'm sorry, it didn't work out. Well, when did you learn this a couple days ago? Well, then you owe us the earnest money. That's how your buyer loses the earnest money in that instance if they did not immediately, for the PSA, inform them of that. So critical to know about that. Now you can notify them immediately and say, can we have 3 days to see if we can go to another lender or these kind of things. But don't try to be sneaky about it, because they're gonna find out, the loan originator or somebody, when the buyer learns this information. Also, make sure your buyer knows that, because they're the one in contact with the loan originator, and it's their name on the contract. The buyer didn't tell you for 5 days. There's nothing we can do about it. They're going to lose their earnest.
And any good loan originator is going to call you immediately. They'll tell the buyer they know it. So what would be reasons after we have a perfectly pre-qualified buyer with good credit? What would be a reason that suddenly the loan can't be approved? Anybody? Yes.
Oh, that could be construed as a fault of the buyer.
Number one. Typically what happens.
Sure. Or like tax returns, they come back and they weren't either what was reflected, fraud, or they came back and the numbers now don't, they made half as much money this year as they made in the last 2 years. It's changed the ratio. They don't qualify for as much.
I would say the biggest reason that this clause is put legitimately into place would be if the buyer loses their job. Or gets hit by a bus. Yeah, they lose their job. And that wouldn't necessarily be a buyer's fault.
And it explicitly states in the next sentence, in this transaction does not record, because of failed to provide notice of inability to obtain loan commitment, it doesn't record through no fault of the seller, the buyer shall be in default. There it is, plain and simple, their earnest money is gone. So notifying if there's an issue with the lender is critical.
Speaking of release of earnest money back to either party, I think it's important that you are real careful never, ever to say to the seller, say the buyer's defaulted in a transaction. I think you're well advised never to tell the seller, oh, the buyer defaulted and you're going to get the buyer's earnest money. Yeah, that may never, ever happen. The seller may be perfectly entitled to the earnest money, but unless the brokers or even going to mediation, if that doesn't go the way, it's not up to us to decide who gets that earnest money, and you need to make real sure that you don't overpromise to your client. But they're going to be really mad at you if they never get that earnest money.
We're just about at the end, but I'm going to quickly point out some things. On page 6, you'll see there where I've written FYI. That's where these clauses came to my attention, except as provided in paragraphs 3, 7, and so on. That is where it dictates, except for those clauses that we just essentially just went through, then it goes on to explain what happens if the buyer's in default. Also, if the seller's in default, really important to know that section 18. Section 19 and 20 also kind of speak to earnest money disputes and what happens if a deal fails to close. And so when your buyer is sitting with you writing an offer and says, hey, what would happen that would cause me not to get my earnest money? You should have some answers there. And the last couple things I'll throw out is Section 8 of this speaks to, so going back a few pages, I skipped it. But page 3 of 9, you'll see Section 8, documents or disclosures required by law. You'll see in the bold there at the end of D, E, and F, if buyer elects to terminate this agreement based upon this investigation, information, or what have you, buyer must provide seller with written notice within the time set forth in paragraph 9L, which is your date to send the repair notice. So if they do the sex offender check, if they do the what's this one? Illegal drug manufacturing site check, that notification needs to go to the seller before you would have been in the deadline to put in the repair commitment. F speaks to the resale agreement, or the resale certificate, which as a bonus, you can back out for any reason up to it. It doesn't even need to be ordered yet. And with the resale certificate, 5 days after the buyer has acknowledged receipt, which it explicitly puts out here.
So let me throw a question on the table that we don't want Shannon to answer. So if it's a new construction property, there is no resale certificate involved. There's another document involved in place of a resale. What is that called? Does anybody know? Carl knows. Carl can't play. No. It's called a public offering statement. It's new construction, and the buyer has 15 days up to receipt of and after receipt to review and decide if they still want to buy the property with full refund of earnest money if they change their mind. Did you want to add anything to that, Shannon?
No, but I wanted to add something to the sex offender thing that I learned a few years back. We had a deal, Mary and I sold a house to a gal, everything was going well, got up to closing, and she backed out because of the sex offender registry, even though we have a form that says that they have until this date to look at it. They technically have until the day of closing, of recording, to look at it. And it's not something that, this may have changed, so if I'm wrong, but as of a few years ago, this deal fell through and she was well within her right to back out because of it. Like the day before.
So the federal law, because the purchase and sale agreement says they need to make that determination by the date of their inspections. But federal law, as Trump said, is that what you're saying, Jim?
Exactly. But sometimes, and then again, it goes back to the broker. So if brokers feel that, they're just playing this card because they got cold feet, that's a different story. But if they, if the buyer really wanted to push it all the way to the court, then.
Yeah, we had, so in this specific case, this girl was buying a house 2 roads down from where she lived with her parents. And we know she got cold feet. Her realtor knew she got cold feet, but she pushed it and stayed living with her parents 2 streets down within that,
Same.
Correct.
Oh my God.
So it was a really awful situation, but she ultimately was able to keep her earnest money and back out. It was awful.
Well, who allowed her to back out if the contract said differently and she didn't know to go to the federal level?
What do you mean? Wait,
well, what broker thought she should get her earnest money back if the contract said otherwise?
I don't remember who made that final decision, but she really pushed at it. She had a relative that worked somehow in this department that this is how we found this out. Like Mary and I did not know that this was even a thing, that they could go all the way up until recording, and she just pushed it, and she was within her rights to do so. Well, her broker was holding it. We were the sellers. It was not our buyer.
Carl, are we out of trouble yet? How are we doing over here?
Yeah. Now we're bulletproof. Now nothing can ever go wrong again. Or more to your point, that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Carl. Good job.
Just to tell you, Kathy, I thought this was gonna be a musical based on the music notes on the
I
flyer.
know. I know.
Don't screw this up.
Thank you. No, what's happening next week? I think we promised HSA.
HSA, yeah, they'll be presenting on the 8th, and they have so many new fun features available to both buyers and sellers. So we're going to have you back come and do a presentation for us and talk about all of that so that we all know what we can and can't do with our home warranty.
And does everybody know that if you do not offer your buyer and your seller client a home warranty,
They have to sign
if you do not offer your buyer client a home warranty and something fails in the property that a warranty would have covered, the buyer can come back to you and ask you to repair it or replace it. So if you have to offer a warranty in all of your transactions, if your client doesn't want the warranty, they have to sign a waiver. We put those waivers in our purchase and sale agreements if that is the case, just so we can always say we did that. But you would be responsible if you haven't offered the warranty, so don't take those lightly.
There is boilerplate in number 15 home warranty protection plans where it says, in the event buyer or seller choose not to purchase a warranty, this paragraph shall serve as the acknowledgement buyer and or seller which waives the right to purchase plan. So you could push back against that,
Okay.
but then there becomes a question like, well, they didn't tell me that. Well, you signed it. So it becomes a whole.
You didn't tell, you didn't.
Still a good idea, just not.
Thanks, everybody. See you next Tuesday.
It's the village
Thank
in
you.
clause.
What?
The village in clause.
What is the village's clause?
They don't offer you dessert, you get free pie.
Good to know.